Today is Thursday, August 20th, 2026, and today is National Bacon Lovers Day. Now, I'm not saying bacon makes everything better. I'm just saying people have wrapped it around steak, put it on donuts, dipped it in chocolate, and even made bacon-flavored toothpaste, which feels less like loving bacon and more like bacon has taken control of the household. And apparently, maybe that's enough is not a part of today's vocabulary. Because we're going to meet a composer who decided his orchestra needed actual artillery. Then we'll follow a telegram all the way around the planet and somehow get back to New York in 16 and a half minutes. And later, we'll find out how the organization that became the NFL started with 4 teams meeting inside a car showroom. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and your guide through the tiny historical details that somehow make humanity look even stranger. So let's start with the canons. In 1880, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky was asked to compose something big for an upcoming celebration in Moscow. Not subtle, not intimate. They wanted something that could commemorate Russia's victory over Napoleon's invading army in 1812. And Tchaikovsky agreed to do it, although he was not exactly inspired. He told his patron that the piece would be very loud and noisy, but because he had written it without warmth or love, it would probably have no artistic merit, which is an amazing review of your own work. Imagine finishing something and immediately saying, "Well, it's loud. That's about all I can promise." But he had a deadline, so he got to work. The piece began quietly, almost like a prayer. Then you start hearing bits of La Marseillaise, representing the French army advancing into Russia. And here's a little fun historical problem. Marseillaise was not actually France's national anthem when Napoleon invaded Russia. Napoleon had banned it. Tchaikovsky used it because his audience would immediately recognize it as musical shorthand for France. So the piece is already doing something movies still do today. It's saying, yes, we know this isn't perfectly accurate, but you understand who the bad guys are. So let's keep moving. As the overture continues, the French theme begins losing ground. Russian melodies take over. Church bells ring. The music keeps building. And then Tchaikovsky writes cannons into the score. Not a drummer trying to sound like a cannon. Cannons. The finished piece calls for 16 cannon blasts, along with bells and a full orchestra. It's less like a concert and more like the orchestra had requested military backup. On August 20th, 1882, the official Moscow premiere of the 1812 overture took place during the All-Russia Arts and Industrial Exhibition. There had been a couple of smaller performances shortly before that, and the enormous outdoor spectacle originally imagined for the piece never quite happened as planned. Even today, most orchestras use a bass drum or recorded effects because firing artillery on cue presents some fairly obvious logistical concerns. The audience loved it. And despite Tchaikovsky's opinion, the piece became one of his most recognizable works. It also became a regular part of American 4th of July celebrations, which is a little strange when you think about it. The 1812 overture has nothing to do with the United States, the Declaration of Independence, or the War of 1812. It's a Russian composer celebrating Russia's defeat of the French. But it has cannons, bells, and a huge finish. So America heard it and apparently said, close enough. Now, cannons are one way to send a message over a long distance. They are not especially useful if the message is more complicated than something just exploded. By 1911, however, telegraph cables connected much of the world. So the New York Times decided to conduct an experiment. How quickly could an ordinary commercial telegram, not a government priority or a military emergency, travel all the way around the planet? At 7 o'clock in the evening of August 20th, a dispatcher on the 17th floor of the Times building in New York sent a very simple message. This message sent around the world. It headed west to San Francisco, then continued across the Pacific through a long chain of cable stations and telegraph offices. The message passed through places including the Philippines, Hong Kong, Saigon, Singapore, Bombay, Malta, Lisbon, and the Azores. 16 different operators handled it, and every handoff created another opportunity for a delay, a technical problem, or someone to look at the message and wonder why New York was doing this. Altogether, it traveled more than 28,000 miles. Then the reply arrived back at the same desk in New York, 16 and a half minutes after the original message had left. That was a commercial telegram circling the planet in 1911. No satellites, no internet, just cables, electrical signals, and 16 people who all managed to do their part without accidentally hitting reply all. The next morning, the Times put the achievement on its front page. Around the world in 16 and a half minutes. And honestly, that headline still works. That telegram circled the planet because 16 operators and a long chain of companies managed to cooperate for 16 and a half minutes. 9 years later, 4 football teams tried something similar. There were professional football teams in 1920, but professional football was still a fairly loose concept. Teams made their own schedules. Players could jump from one club to another. Owners competed for talent without any shared rules holding the whole thing together. So on August 20th, representatives from 4 Ohio teams met in Canton. There were the Akron Pros, the Canton Bulldogs, the Cleveland Indians, and the Dayton Triangles. And they held this meeting inside a Hut Mobile automobile showroom. Not a hotel ballroom, not a giant conference center. They sat down among the cars. The showroom belonged to Ralph Hay, who also owned the Canton Bulldogs. The men agreed to form something called the American Professional Football Conference. That name is not particularly catchy, but give them a minute. They met again in September with representatives from additional teams. At that meeting, they reorganized as the American Professional Football Association and selected Jim Thorpe as president. Thorpe was one of the most famous athletes in the world, so putting him in charge gave the new organization instant credibility. They also established a membership fee of $100 per team. Apparently, no team ever paid it. So the organization that eventually became a multi-billion-dollar sports empire began with 4 Ohio teams, a meeting between the Hutmobiles, and an unpaid invoice. In 1922, the association adopted a much better name, the National Football League. Of those original 4 teams, only the Dayton Triangles have a direct line to the current NFL franchise. After a long series of sales, moves, and name changes, their history eventually leads to the Indianapolis Colts. The Canton Bulldogs disappeared. The Akron Pros folded. The original Cleveland team vanished too. Even the Hutmobile is gone. But the little football organization created in that showroom kept growing until it became a cultural monster. And speaking of cultural monsters, someone else born on this date created a few of those. He was born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1890. As a child, he became fascinated by astronomy, chemistry, old architecture, and books. He wanted to become an astronomer. But poor health and emotional struggles disrupted his education. He never attended college. Instead, he wrote. A lot. He produced essays, poems, stories, an enormous number of letters. He also worked in amateur journalism and revised other people's writings, occasionally doing so much work that he was essentially ghostwriting the finished story. His own fiction appeared mostly in pulp magazines. The worlds he created were filled with forbidden books, decaying New England towns, ancient beings, and people slowly realizing that humanity is not nearly as important as it thinks it is. His monsters weren't always evil in the usual sense. Some barely noticed human beings at all, which is somehow worse. One of his best-known creatures sleeps beneath the Pacific Ocean in a sunken city, waiting for the stars to become properly aligned. That would be Cthulhu. Born on August 20th, 1890, the writer was Howard Phillips Lovecraft, better known as H.P. Lovecraft. He died in 1937 with little money and no idea how enormous his influence would become. His stories later inspired generations of writers, filmmakers, musicians, and game designers. Cthulhu is now so recognizable that you can buy plushy versions of an ancient cosmic entity whose awakening is supposed to destroy the human mind. Lovecraft's legacy also comes with something we can't brush aside: His racism was extreme, even by the standards of his time, and it wasn't separate from his imagination. His fear of other people and cultures worked its way into the fiction alongside the cosmic dread. That leaves us with a complicated figure, a writer who helped reinvent horror, but whose vision was partly powered by a very human prejudice. Tchaikovsky thought his overture lacked artistic merit, and it became one of his most famous compositions. A routine telegram demonstrated that the planet had become much smaller than people realized. 4 football teams met in a car showroom and created the beginnings of the NFL, while a relatively obscure pulp writer built monsters that outlived him. None of them could completely control what their creation became once other people got a hold of it. Anyway, I'm gonna make some bacon and enjoy the fact that cooking it is the only part of breakfast that sounds vaguely like cannon fire. And since nearly everything today became bigger and stranger than expected, Yogi Berra gets the last word. The future ain't what it used to be. If you'd like to hear more of my work, narration, podcasts, or other projects, you can find it all at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns, and thanks for wandering through history with me for a while. I'll see you tomorrow.